So, together with my colleagues Deuss and Garvie, I would like to give you an idea of what we are actually doing under this rulemaking task 727, introduction of the new basic regulation in Part 21. I would like to give you a brief introduction, and actually for those of you who attended last year's session here, you will remember a couple of these slides already. So I would like to give you first an overview of the new basic regulation and the need. Why do we need to change something in Part 21? And then my colleagues will introduce to you the idea of introducing in Part 21 proportionate rules for aircraft intended primarily for sports and recreational use, why we are doing that, and the concept that we currently have in mind of doing so. And then my colleagues and I would like to make you familiar with a new concept in the basic regulation, which is the certification of non-installed equipment. And we also would like to explain you why it is there and our first ideas of what you will see in the future as a proposal that we will consult with you. So in terms of a brief introduction, of an overview, these topics, these slides, you will remember from last year, just a bit of an introduction, a refresher. So the new basic regulation entered into force in September last year and repealed the old basic regulation, and making the link to one of the questions that we discussed just a minute ago. Regulation 216/2008 is still applicable in Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein today, until the treaty with Switzerland and with the EEA states are amended. The idea of rulemaking task 272 is twofold. The lower part of this chart, we need to introduce the changes in the basic regulation also in Part 21. I will give you a couple of examples in a minute of why that is necessary. And we are already, before we discussed the changes to the new basic regulation, dealing with the rulemaking activity on Part 21 proportionality and in Part 21. And we are combining now these ideas, proportionality, which now also in the basic regulation received some new tools in our regulatory toolbox, in this one rulemaking task 727. On this slide and on the next slide, I would like to give you some ideas of why we need to change Part 21. The first two ones are related to our toolbox. So if you compare the old basic regulation and the new basic regulation, it strengthens two important elements that we can use for our future rulemaking, which is a requirement that we should be, where possible, more performance-based and more objective-based, and also allow different means of achieving compliance with the regulation. And we should specifically look at the scalability, the proportionality of the risk, the operation, whether the operation is open to the public, the effect on third parties on the ground, the complexity of the aircraft, persons' affected ability to assess the risk. So this is explicitly now mentioned in the basic regulation, and with all the activities that we are doing, we have to take that into consideration. Then, more on the content side, there have been some concepts in Part 21 that are now treated slightly different in the basic regulation, and we need to align that. So what you'll find in the basic regulation now is a possibility for approved organizations to also issue, under a privilege, more certificates than today. Today, we have minor changes, major repairs, and STCs. This is now more open in the basic regulation. So in the future, one may imagine, if we implement that, also privileges for TCs or for OSD approvals. Then you'll find a sentence in the new basic regulation that it's not necessarily required any longer that engines hold their own TC. It is possible in the future that an aircraft can be certified together with the engine without the engine holding its own type certificate. Also this is not yet reflected in the Part 21. There is a new animal in the basic regulation, non-installed equipment, and a sentence which says that non-installed equipment shall be certified, even with the possibility to do this under a privilege for the organization. There is a new structure, slightly different requirements in the basic regulation for the issuance of the restricted certificate of airworthiness and the permit of flight, more in relation to a TC and a C of A. A restricted type certificate always goes with a restricted C of A. And then as an alternative, a permit to fly. Part 21 is not fully reflecting this system today. There is a possibility that under certain conditions, an organizational approval, DOA, POA, is not necessarily required if the risk is low. In that case, the basic regulation allows as an alternative that the organization can declare its capabilities and that it complies with the requirements in Part 21, and then the oversight of the competent authority kicks in. So no approval to be issued to start your business, you declare your capabilities, and then you start working and you will be overseen. There's also a possibility not to issue certificates to, for example, products, but that the organization may declare compliance with, let's say in our case, design requirements. So no TC maybe in the future, and only a declaration of compliance with design standards. Again, under certain conditions where there is lower risks, and we have to reflect that also in Part 21, whether and to what extent we want to go that way. There's a new Annex 3 for environmental essential requirements. In the past, there was a strict and only reference to ICAO Annex 16. If the product was not in the scope of ICAO Annex 16, no environmental requirements apply to it. Now the basic regulation says if ICAO Annex 16 is not applicable, then these essential requirements in Annex 3 apply. So we have to work on the environmental certification basis, maybe develop something like the concept of special condition to it, have to adapt certain other requirements in Part 21 that are today looking at safety only and open them for environment. And also a lot of terminology has changed, definition have changed. Parts, appliances, non-installed equipment, the definition of certificate has changed, the declaration has been inserted. So the list goes on. These are just the highlights that I wanted to repeat. We have to look at all of these issues, and we would like to familiarize you today with two of these concepts, of two of these aspects that we need to implement in Part 21 in a bit more detail. The one topic is the proportionality for rules for aircraft intended primarily for sports and recreational use, what we call under a slogan Part 21 Light, so the proportionality idea that I mentioned earlier this morning. And then the second topic on non-installed equipment, this new animal in Part 21. So we would like to start with the proportionate rules, and I would like to ask my colleagues Deuss and Garvie to support me here.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So I'm Deuss, I'm a regulations officer, and together with Garvie, we are the two guys in EASA working on, in particular, this change to Part 21, the proportionate rules that are primarily used or intended for aircraft used for sports and recreational. We call it Part 21 Light because that's easier to recognize what we are discussing. Again, to what Michael already explained to you, we are using some of the elements in the new basic regulation in order to do this proportionality for GA. The first one that he also highlighted is the possibility to build more performance-based and objective-based rules. If you look at the number of rulemaking activities that we show you, I think this is for our future a very important tool. If we are able to draft rules that are legally acceptable but that can resist the change of technology, we will move ahead a lot and do better changes in our means of compliances and keep the rules stable. The second bullet point, the requirement shall be proportionate to the risk, is a bit of an open door, especially if you look at Part 21 Light. This is typically where we didn't have the proportionality that we needed before. The old-timers who've known EASA from the start know that we have been trying to work for GA, and we were always stopped by the basic regulation that said you have to have certificates, you have to have approved organizations. With the change of the new basic regulation, that door has opened, and this is what we can use for Part 21 Light. The last two bullet points are very important. Those are the possibilities to use declarations. There's one side of the picture for the organization, so a design and a production organization doesn't necessarily have to hold an approval from EASA in the future when the risks are acceptable low, and the same goes for the product. So we don't necessarily have to have a certificate or a type certificate for an aircraft if the risk is low. So these are the elements coming from the new basic regulation that will help us to shape the Part 21 Light. Very important in the concept that we're developing, because we're in the process of developing a concept. We don't have a full picture yet, but very important elements that we keep in our mind when we're developing all the ideas. I put them all straight on to the slide, and I'll go clockwise if you are still analog. So if you go from the top left-hand corner, it is important to understand there is no change in the responsibilities between EASA and the member states' authorities. EASA basically is still responsible for design. Production is still with the member states. So that doesn't change. The basic regulation hasn't changed that at all. So that is one of the starting points that we cannot change, that will remain. Second one at the top, a regulatory system for GA that allows progressive engagement with EASA. I think that's also very important to keep that in mind, that we've always struggled with new companies trying to get into the EASA world. Certifying your organization and your aircraft at the same time was really a steep ramp up to get into the EASA system. We're trying now to create a concept that allows a gradual introduction into the European system with the involvement of EASA, increasing if the risks increase. So we try to build a ramp up into the system all the way up to the full Part 21 if we can. The other corner, possibility to choose between two different processes to certify the aircraft, either go for a type certificate and a CFA, or go for a restricted CFA without a type certificate. And we try to build in really the possibility to choose depending on your business model if you need one or the other. So it's not exclusively one or the other, it depends on your business model. Next one is the possibility of using a declaration, first of all, to demonstrate the organizational capabilities. So that is one of the cornerstones from the basic regulation. And the other one is the compliance of the design with a cert basis or industry standards to declare that the aircraft complies with the essential requirements. The bottom one in the slide, product-oriented, using coordination between design and production, is something that you hopefully have already seen in the new AMC and guidance that was published for Part 21 for the lower end. We're trying to focus more on the outcome of the process, not the paperwork. We want to look at the product, the aircraft, the engine, in order to see if the process is well controlled and the design as well. That does require a close cooperation between design and production. You cannot look at the aircraft and without knowing the design. So, and when the design is EASA's responsibility, an NIE looking at an aircraft and saying, okay, this should be the evidence that your production is sound, they need to understand the aircraft. So that's why it needs to be linked. Next one, certification process corresponding with the nature and risk of the product activity. That is already addressed. Yes, we have to build in scalability. The last red box is again very important. We need a cooperative spirit between all stakeholders. If we really want to be product oriented, we have to exchange information between applicants, production organization side of it, the NIEs and the EASA. So we have to share information in order to make it a light process. So what's the concept that we are developing? And I said we're in the middle. We've proposed so far in 2 workshops a proportionate system where we put a Part 21 light in parallel to the existing Part 21. So we are not going to touch Part 21 as it exists today. That would be a potential risk if we change something in Part 21 and we inadvertently affect something in large organizations. I don't think that will go down very well. So we're creating a separate Part 21 light where we initially said we're going to build this to a scope similar to Part M light. Part M light gives criteria on the design, the weight of the aircraft, these kind of things. But actually that doesn't really capture all the risks that we want to have in the scope. So we are currently still working on how to develop a right scope for Part 21 light that covers aircraft intended primarily for sports and recreational use, because that is what the basic regulation has asked us to look at. The process, if we go to Part 21, starts with a risk evaluation and to see if that application, that declaration really fits within Part 21. And if you go, or Part 21 light. If you go into Part 21 light, we'll have 2 processes in parallel. We still have a light certified process, that's in the middle, and we have a light declared process on the side. It's very important to understand that the basic differences between those 2 are, if you go for a light certified process, you go for a type certificate and a C of A, full swing, globally acceptable. If you go for a light declared process, there will not be a type certificate in that process, and it will end up, and this is also embedded in the basic regulation, it will be a restricted certificate of airworthiness. It's a European system only, so keep that in mind. I zoom in a little bit on those 2 processes, so the light certified process in Part 21 light, the one that we're developing. So again, it goes to a type certificate in the end of the process. It's an EASA approval and ICAO compliant type certificate. The whole idea, and this is the scope of Part 21 light, we want to use the process only when the risk is known and limited. So we only accept this for conventional designs, non-novel, using acceptable standards and widely used special conditions. So we know what we're talking about. This is not the latest urban mobility vehicle. This is really well-known aircraft. Looking at design capability, yes, you can still use a DOA if you want to use this process, but we also provide the possibility to use a declaration of the design capability. In brackets, with oversight, it is important a declaration in the system is not just I sign a declaration and I'm fine. No, we have an involvement, we keep contact. This is the cooperative spirit that we need to have. So a design organization with a declaration will still have visits from NIEs and EASA. So the same for production. Yes, you can use a POA for Part 21 light, but you can also use a declaration of your production capabilities with the oversight again, And it are still the basic elements that allow you to come to a full TC. So a declared production, a declared design organization can go through a certification process leading to a type certificate. The oversight is important. We do want to keep in touch with the applicants, the builders of the aircraft. So in this process, this type certification light process, we will be looking at the compliance demonstration plan, and the certification basis, of course, needs to be approved. And we will build in on-site checks before, first of all, the first prototype flies. We've so far taken 2 points in the timeline saying, we want to be there before the first prototype flies. That's our possibility to look at the aircraft in cooperation with the NIE. So look at the product, the way how it's built, the way how it's designed. And secondly, also an on-site check and test flight before the first production aircraft is released. So we have a few points in the process where we definitely want to see the product and visit the company. So this is light certified EASA involvement leading to a type certificate. If you go to the other box in Part 21 Light, it's the light declared process. So there is a declaration of compliance, and again, the scope is not that different from the other one. It's for conservative designs, non-novel, using acceptable standards. Important here, there is no EASA approval in this light declared process. The responsibility entirely stays with the company, the person declaring that they comply with the requirements and the cert basis. That is not globally recognized. That is a European system that we're setting up. If you look at design and production capability, you'll see that it's exactly the same as what I showed to you on the previous slide. You can still be a DOA or a declared design capable organization, and the same for production. That is not different at all. Also, oversight is actually fairly similar, and the reason why it's fairly similar is that the oversight is really related to the organization. We are not doing oversight on a certification process, we're doing oversight on the declared design and the declared production organizations. Those are the elements, the very important steps that we have in this process. Where are we right now? Because we've organized workshops for this, and we have lots of discussions going on. This is not a meeting where we can do the same in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. We are discussing development of this concept through workshops. We decided not to go for an NPA. It is too much of a development process for a good concept to put a final result in an NPO. So we are working through workshops. We started in Aero this year, had a second one in July, and a third one will be in December on the 18th. And this is where we develop and exchange the ideas on the Part 21 Light concept. That is really where you should be available. I'm not sure, Carl, we tried to put a slide up during the coffee break where you can find the event page and the web page where we communicate about this topic. I'm not sure if that will happen, but I will really ask you to get in touch with the EASA on this topic, get involved. We, Carl and I, cannot develop a good concept by ourselves. We really need your help. So please contribute. You can do it today with the Slido questions. You can also do it on our webpage where we have a dedicated email address for questions about this concept. The end result of this process is that we are aiming for an opinion late next year that will go to the Commission for a Part 21 Light proposal. There was something else I wanted to share with you. Yeah, there's a lot more information. I cannot explain everything to you. We have a dedicated page on our website for Part 21 Light, and on that page is a PDF document that summarizes what we have discussed in the first 2 workshops. And more importantly, in that document, you'll find a number of flowcharts explaining how we see the process for certified and declared. Also interesting in there is that the second workshop, one of the main topics was, so how do we do changes in this process? Also for those processes, there are flowcharts in that document, and I really would encourage you to have a look. That explains how we think we can use the elements to make changes. Because we have to find a nice trick for declared organizations that, according to the basic regulations, will not have privileges, to still make changes and not be stopped in the whole process because they're declared organizations. So we've tried to find neat ways of making sure that also declared organizations can work with the system, make changes to their designs in a fairly easy way. Partially using CS10 if we have to, but the main elements is we try to work with the corporation, the link between us and the production and design organizations. With those regular visits, we are also able to cover these kind of changes to the process. So there's a lot more information. Please go to our website on Part 21 Lite, have a look at the document, and your input is more than welcome. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Bodewijn. Before we break, I think we have a few questions on the topic. Maybe we can display the Slido questions on the screen. And Michael or Bodewijn, I don't know whether you can answer some of them right away.
Well, I can start from the top if you like. If the organization does not require EASA approval, then who's assessing the capability of the organization? Well, if this is typically pointing at a declared organization, the declaration will be fairly detailed, what we're trying to develop, and will be sent to EASA to be recorded and put on our website. So, first of all, we'll know who we're dealing with and how they're organizing themselves. What we will do is have a look if someone wants to apply the Part 21 process, we have to make sure that it's appropriate to do so. So we will have a look at the eligibility of an organization. Are you really an organization that should fit within this level of risk? So EASA will look at the eligibility early in the process when we receive the declaration from those organizations. So we'll know quite some detail about the organization, and we'll have a look at if you are in the right Part 21. The other one, can this also be applicable for non-EU organizations? That's a tricky one, but I think it probably will be. The same as we have today, that EASA also has responsibilities for companies outside of Europe if you talk about production, but you will be part of the European system, of course. How will this new proposed approach meet the ICAO Annex 8 requirements? For the type certified, it is ICAO compliant fully. The thing is, in the declared design and production organizations, this is where we start to deviate, and then we don't have an ICAO compliant process anymore. So the type certified process in Part 21 Lite is fully ICAO Annex 8. I like the next one. Will parts made under the sorry.
To complement, and then the declared process is not ICAO Annex 8 compliant, and that's the reason why it's only a European concept, so you cannot validate these certificates in foreign countries. It's a national, in our case, European approval.
I like the next question. Will parts made under the declaration be issued with an EASA Form 1 or big question mark? Today, only a POA has the privilege to issue an EASA Form 1. So if we go for a declared production organization, that will not be the same EASA Form 1. We haven't decided on the details yet, but of course, the information with the release of a part from a production organization is still necessary to be provided to the next user in the process. So we'll have to see how we do this, but if it's a C of C or whatever kind of document in EASA Form 1A, B, C, I don't know, we'll probably, and that's again going to the objective rules, I think we probably have to define what kind of data has to be made available when a part is released from production. And that must be very clear, that if you are an end user, you need to know who manufactured, to what design, and when it was released, and if there are any restrictions. So there are a number of elements on the EASA Form 1 that definitely will need to be covered, even if a part is released from a non-POA. The next one, will urban taxi be relevant to light certification process? As I said before, we're looking at conventional designs. So if you fly a Cessna 172 as an urban taxi, maybe, but I don't see that happening. No new designs will not fit in Part 21 Light. One of the main reasons for that is actually that, first of all, we need to know the risk. But secondly, if we want to accept declarations, it's a declaration against a known standard. We're not going to accept declarations saying, I have blue eyes, I design aircraft. No, you have to show how you meet the requirements, and they need to be known. So our idea is that your declarations will be linked to known standards. Yes, I'm going to design an aircraft to CS23, level 1. This is the way how I'm going to do it. So I don't see in today an urban taxi being certified in Part 21 Light. It does highlight a very interesting discussion and challenge that we have, is the scope of Part 21 Light will be conventional, low risk. And what is conventional today might not be the same as tomorrow. New technology becomes daily practice in a couple of years. So we have the challenge to find a way to create something in Part 21 Light where technologies that might be very innovative today could flow into Part 21 Light in the future when we consider that we know what the risks are and we have good standards. So this is one of our challenges. How can we create a scope in Part 21 Light that is flexible, but at the same time giving sufficient legal certainty? And that is something that we haven't solved that puzzle. We're looking at what is SORA doing for drones. Maybe some kind of analysis of the risk could help, but still we have to find something that is linked to known standards.
Okay, one last question. The one on the production organizations who are currently overviewed by the NIEs. Who has the oversight in production in this new process? Michael, I don't know whether you or Bodo have the answer.
So it's clear, we don't want to change the oversight, and we can't change because in the basic regulation it's clear where EASA has the oversight, where the member states authorities have the oversight. And for production, it's the member states. So unless you fall into one of the exceptions for a single POA, the basic principle of subsidiarity for production, also in the Part 21 Light process, it will be the member states NIEs.
In addition to that, again, back to the basic principles of this idea, it will need to be a cooperation between EASA and the NIEs to look at the product. We need to know the design in order to check if the production makes sense. So yes, it's responsibility NIA, but it will be far more a team effort than what we have right now.
Okay, thank you Bodo and Michael for the update on the requirements. Okay, now we come to the second half of the presentation on new basic regulation. And it's again, don't be surprised, Michael Gerhard and the colleagues talking about non-installed equipment. Michael.
Thank you, Markus. What you didn't hear was that in our bilateral talk, he just complained that it's again me. So I have to talk to Markus for next year's agenda, but I hope that you still bear with me or even enjoy the presentation. So what we have in mind now, we continue the topic of new basic regulation, and we wanted to introduce to you a new concept that has been introduced in that new basic act and that we have to now look at and implement in part 21. So we're talking about the new non-installed equipment, NIE, what's the abbreviation that we are using for that. Maybe I'm going to explain you a little bit more what we think is NIE and what the basic regulation determines what NIE should be. But maybe just for the sake of the exercise, for the beginning of the presentation, think about an emergency parachute, think about a cargo tracking device, something that is not part of the type design, but that is brought into the aircraft and could have a safety effect. And it's not always brought into the same aircraft, so it can also move between aircraft. So if we start from the picture of the old basic regulation, if you still remember Regulation 216/2008 and the chapter on, or it was an article at that point in time, Article 5, on how to ensure initial airworthiness, on how to ensure airworthiness. It was addressed to the product only. Airworthiness was ensured by the product, aircraft engine propeller, holding a type certificate or restricted type certificate, and then the individual aircrafts being produced holding a C of A, restricted C of A, or a permit to fly. In addition, there was a possibility to also approve parts and appliances which were later installed into the aircraft. So it became part of the type design. That was the status under the old basic regulation. There was nothing regulated for the airworthiness of equipment that was not installed and was never supposed to be installed in the aircraft. And that has changed with the regulation from last year. There's now a new article, Article 13 in the regulation, which says the design of non-installed equipment shall be subject to certification and shall be issued with a certificate. It's totally new, a new animal in the system. I omitted here deliberately a couple of words in the beginning of the sentence in the parenthesis. There is an important addition to that. I will come back to that in 2 slides. So why was the basic regulation changed for that? Why is it necessary, on top of certifying the product, to also certify non-installed equipment? The reason is fairly simple, because also from that equipment there could be a safety effect. The aircraft, the products, could suffer from an ineffective, non-well-functioning equipment that is brought into the aircraft. We've tried to put here on slides some examples, but it's surely not exclusive. It could, the equipment could have electromagnetic emissions, provide incorrect flight information, could lead to an uncontained fire, leakages, and non-provisions of the intended function in case of an emergency. So they do have a safety effect. And the idea of the legislator, of the Parliament and the Council, by including this certification requirement, was to also address this in order to ensure that we have an even safer aviation. And as I mentioned before, the previous basic regulation didn't have such a provision, so there was no possibility to certify something like an emergency parachute. We tried to cope and to mitigate that in the past by using the ETSO process and considering them being parts or appliances. We, for example, did that for the parachutes. So you find an ETSO C23F, or for containers in C92D. And we also had received before the basic regulation was changed, requests from you, from industry, to also certify certain equipment that is not qualified as parts or appliances. The electronic flight bag is always used as an example for that. And this reason why to introduce this certification requirement is also reflected in something else that has changed in the basic regulation, namely in Annex 2, the essential requirements for airworthiness. They are basically unchanged compared to the basic regulation, but a new point or new paragraph 1.4 has been introduced in the essential requirements for airworthiness. And it has only 3 subparagraphs, but it shows also the reason why this non-installed equipment shall be certified. The requirement that we need to ensure, that we need to implement in Part 21 is that the non-installed equipment must perform its safety functions or functions relevant for safety as intended or under any foreseeable operational conditions, unless that function can also be performed by other means. The non-installed equipment must be operable without needing exceptional skills or strengths. And the non-installed equipment, whether functioning properly or improperly, must not reduce safety and must not adversely affect the proper functioning of any other equipment system or appliance. So these are the requirements set in the basic regulation. So if we want to ensure the safety benefit through a certification, additional new certification of non-installed equipment, we now need to see what is non-installed equipment. And in the basic regulation, you will now find a definition in Article 3.29 that qualifies equipment as non-installed equipment if it meets 4 criteria. It's any instrument, equipment, mechanism, apparatus, appurtenance, software or accessory, which is carried on board of an aircraft by the aircraft operator. First important condition, not by a passenger, for example, which is not a part, so a clear distinction between the ETSO part, the article, and non-installed equipment, and which is used or intended to be used in operating or controlling an aircraft, supporting the occupant's survivability, or which could impact the safe operation of the aircraft. And considering that there's also a definition of part in the basic regulation, which I've put in small letters underneath the box, which is any element of a product as defined by the product's type design, you'll see that the non-installed equipment is not part of the type design which is certified under the TC. So this is a quite broad definition, and a lot of equipment could meet that definition. So we have to see what kind of non-installed equipment really needs an additional certification. And here it's important, the letters that I have omitted from my first slide. So in the orange box here on the right-hand side, coming back to Article 13, it starts with the sentence where the delegated act referred to in Article 19 so provide. The design of non-installed equipment shall be subject to certification. So we have to decide in Part 21 where there is a safety benefit of certifying non-installed equipment and define properly in Part 21 what has to undergo this additional certification. It's by no means said in the basic regulation, and we will certainly not say in Part 21 in the future, that everything that meets the definition of Article 329 has to be certified. So we have to identify in the delegated act, so in our case Part 21 is a delegated act to the basic regulation, we will have to define what non-installed equipment requires certification. And that is one important bit of the rulemaking task. We have to assess the safety needs, the impacts, do a properly regulatory impact assessment in identifying which non-installed equipment in the future requires certification. To give you a bit of an idea, yeah, that is an important, sorry, I forgot this one. We also have to consider that certain non-installed equipment may sometimes be also part of the type design. So an equipment like a headset could, if so decided by the TC holder, be part of the type design and part of the TC. If it's not part of the type design, it can also be non-installed equipment. So the two processes should not be too different, because the same equipment can be at one point in time a part, for another, in another point of time can be a non-installed equipment. To give you a bit of an idea of what we consider at the moment requiring certification, there is an additional safety need for certification. And important is it's work in progress. We have started the discussion. We are trying to define where is the safety benefit. But what you could imagine is that certain equipment can be, like the headset, sometimes be a part or a non-installed equipment, depending on its use. So we do have examples like the headphones that today already have an ETSO, or for which we have an ETSO, which can receive an ETSO authorization. So these equipment we can easily also qualify as a non-installed equipment if they can also be used outside of the type design for certain uses. So that could be an example, but really question mark we are discussing could be an example for non-installed equipment in the future. As I mentioned in the beginning, we also have certain parts today for which we have an ETSO, but if you would strictly apply the definition of part to this equipment, they are not qualifying in the future any longer as being a part. It's rather non-installed equipment, like life preservers. So we could clean up ETSO, and for those parts which are really non-installed equipment, take them out of the ETSO world and put them into the NIE world in the future. There's also equipment where today in other regulations there's a need to certify them, to approve them, like in the OPS rules, for example. So also these ones we could submit to the certification of non-installed equipment. And we are also considering other examples. The examples that were used when the basic regulation was discussed, which I put here as pictures underneath the dotted line, were the emergency parachutes, the electronic flight bag, the cargo tracking devices, what I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. So clear equipment that is not, at least for the parachutes and the tracking devices, never part of the type design, but which could have a safety effect if there's a malfunction. So we could consider some of them qualifying as non-installed equipment and require certification in the future. We are carefully reviewing this topic. It's one of the most important topics now at the beginning of the rulemaking task, because we want to understand the scope of this new certification requirement. We have to conduct impact assessments. We have to see what the consequences are. It doesn't make sense to certify small equipment which have a limited safety benefit, make them subject to a certification process. In one of our advisory bodies in the DM Tech, the first example that was given by one of the colleagues was for certain pilots, depending on your classes, you cannot operate your aircraft without the classes. Is that non-installed equipment, yes or no? Shall we certify the classes? I find that a very good example, but it will not end up in this NIE world. What I personally expect, looking at the discussion that we have currently internally, is that we will certainly start with a very limited number of list of non-installed equipment that will be in the future subject to a certification process. And we will clearly identify the safety benefit, or on the other hand, the safety risk if there's a malfunction that makes sense that we require a certification for that non-installed equipment. So when we know what non-installed equipments are, we also have to look at the certification process that we want to establish. And there we have different options, we are considering different possibilities, but there are certain things that are already pretty clear, and we would also like to introduce them to you to give you an idea in which direction it goes. You will hear more about these proposals. We will certainly involve you. We will also go for a public consultation through an NPA. But to give you an idea in which direction what we are looking at, we would like to give you some indications. My colleague Garvie is taking over.
Thank you, Michael. I think when you think about NIE, we think about this being a new entity. But if you consider a product or a part, it has to meet some kind of requirements, and the requirements are contained in the essential requirements in the new Annex 2. And it's up to Part 21 to define how we treat those. But if you think of it as being a product or a part, we go through a process. And that process, first of all, we have to define what the article has to comply with. What is the certification basis? What are the specifications? And we could do that through having some kind of generic certification specifications. We could use industry standards, or we could have equipment-specific certification specifications. So that's the what. What does the article have to do? Then we have to look at the entity or the organization which is designing those articles, and we want them to have some kind of competence. So we could do that through a DOA, an AP DOA, or, as mentioned earlier, we have new tools within the new basic regulation. We could consider a declared design organization for certain classifications of non-installed equipment. Again, in the same way as a product or a part, we want the actual article that's been manufactured to comply with the design that's been approved. So we'd have to look at that element of non-installed equipment. And likewise, the organization that's actually manufacturing these articles, repeatedly, we want them to be conforming with the design, and we want to ensure that this organization is competent. Again, we could do that through a POA, or if the risk is low, we could do that through a declared production organization. And again, we don't want to just throw these articles out into the world. We want to ensure that the operators that are using them or have the instructions to be able to use them in the safe way within the limitations of what the article can do. The word proportionality has been used a number of times, but I think it's fair to say that one size does not fit all. We can't keep applying the same rigid regulations to everything when the risk doesn't necessarily justify the level of rigor. So we could provide a proportionate regulatory process for NIE. And how would that work? Well, we could define different classes of NIE based upon the risk using some kind of criteria. So we could state, for example, the criticality of a certain NIE is minor or major, and use that as a metric to measure the classification of it. So if you imagine a sliding scale, I don't know how many classes we are thinking of, but we could 3, 4, 5, 6 classes, or even 3 of NIE, and then based upon those, we would classify what the organizational requirements could be. So for higher risk, we might require more rigid organizational requirements. For lower risk, we might be more loose and look at declarations with oversight based upon the classification of that NIE. We could decide that an organization approval is not necessarily required, and we could quite happily look at the risk of the article and think that actually we could live with a declaration of design capability. And we could actually look at a declaration for compliance of that article. We could build a system where we have the process and the regulatory requirements in Part 21, and then in a dedicated CS or a partner CS, define the classification, and that would then signpost you to what the organizational requirements are and the certification process you need to follow. So the two would very much link together, so you know that for a certain article, this is a class X. I can look in Part 21 and find the process I have to follow. In order to build that process, we'd have to look at different options. And again, we're considering the regulatory impact of these different options. Obviously, we could just slot NIE into the existing ETSO process, but these different options have different advantages and disadvantages. If we just put it straight into the ETSO process, the disadvantage would be it might not be entirely proportionate. We only have 2 levels of risk within the current ETSO process. We could decide to, in parallel, develop an NIE process which sits alongside the ETSO process, and there we could be as proportionate as we wanted to be and develop a parallel system. But again, there could be an issue with interconnection between the processes and also disproportionality between the two. Or we could go for the Big Bang and look at a process where we combine NIE and ETSO parts into a single process with a different regulatory outcome at the end and reclassify some of the ETSO aspects. Or we could think of something else. And we're currently at that decision stage where we're looking at the different options and considering those in terms of safety benefits and also organizational benefit. We've talked about declarations a few times already, but at the end of whatever certification process we decide, a certificate would be issued either by EASA or possibly, if we would permit that, an approved organization could do so under privilege. Or, if we consider the risk of the article is low, we could possibly permit the declaration of compliance with the certification specifications. So you can see we're exploring different options to try and have a smooth transition from high risk to low risk and not try the one-size-fits-all approach. The next steps for this rulemaking task, again, we're evaluating the different options and the regulatory impact of doing so. We're engaging with stakeholders, we're talking to them. We're looking at development of a proposal for that with ultimately with an NPA which will be consulted. We will then develop an opinion and hopefully very soon NIE will be adopted into Part 21. That concludes the session on NIE.
And the idea of this presentation was to explain to you the first ideas on the concept and to get your immediate feedback. And I think the number of questions registered in Slido shows that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. Some of them can easily be answered by the colleagues right away, but some others are exactly the reason why we raised this point with you, because we need your input to set up the system in the right way. Yes? Michael, you want to start with some of the questions on Slido? Or Carl?
Yeah, for fire extinguishing bottles, I'm not sure if we want to try and, we could spend all morning looking at different options, whether they're in scope or outside of scope. Again, I want to try and avoid examples. As soon as you think about examples of NIE, it closes down your thinking into how you can categorize it and how you can work with it. Again, a defibrillator, we'd have to consider that. We're going to look at the risk classification and criteria. I think generally, if it's not currently required to be certified, then we're not going to go certification shopping and look for new articles just to certify them. iPads. The question on iPads, in terms of EFBs, again, one of the options we're considering is doesn't a production organization necessarily be required for those when the actual design relates to software, purely software? We could build in an option within the NIE process where if there's no physical outcome, no physical product, perhaps we could live with a declaration of compliance for production, or we could actually look at no production organization being required at all. Loose equipment, I think loose equipment, unless it's being used to operate the aircraft and falls within the definition of NIE, then I think there's a clear distinction between the two of those. I don't think loose equipment could be considered to be NIE unless it's being used to operate the aircraft. pillows and blankets? I don't think so, unless it affects the safety of the aircraft.
Just from looking at the question, it seems that the most interest is to see what kind of equipment really requires certification in the future. But this is actually the discussion that we have internally. So we have to make for all of these things a risk assessment and see whether it's necessary for safety benefit to submit them to the certification process. And in accordance with that, then build the scope of the requirements in Part 21. But here it's difficult to say whether in the future these kind of equipments will fall under or not.
Michael, maybe one of the questions from Franz Redak about containers currently having an ETSO authorization, would it mean removal of the ETSO, and how is it working also with the FAA? But I think you're mixing two different things on this, because you still could get an ETSO even if it's an NIE.
So there are two aspects to that. If the equipment can also be part of the type design, then it could receive an ETSO authorization and a non-installed equipment certification both, if it qualifies for both processes. If it's equipment that today, with the new definitions in Part 21 for parts and non-installed equipment, is not a part any longer, does not meet the definition of part any longer, and depending on how we build the process, we may take that out of CS ETSO and submit that to then the non-installed equipment process. So does NIE spell the demise of COTS? There's no relation to commercial off-the-shelf parts, no. So how do airline operators know what NIE are and what prevents them from having them in the aircraft without certification? So we're also looking at the link between then Part 21 and OPS in that respect. If something is subject to a certification as non-installed equipment, this will be clearly visible. As Carl mentioned, one of the options that we have is maybe to use something very similar as the CS ETSO process. So there could be something like CS NIE in the future, then clearly identifying this equipment, this kind of equipment, tracking devices, require certification so that it's known, and the link in the OPS regulation will be built under whether and under which conditions this equipment can be brought into the aircraft. Ideally, there should be no additional check from the operators or no additional actions from the operators if the equipment is certified.
I think, Gilles, your question on the fees is maybe a bit early because we are just talking about the concept, but for sure it needs to be reflected then in an update of the fees and charges regulation. But that is part of the discussion about the complexity, self-declaration, what kind of involvement of the EASA or the NIAs for the production is required. So it's a valid question, but maybe a bit too early.
And we note for the minutes of the meeting that Dassault is ready to pay fees. Thank you. There was a question on retrospect. Yeah, how will non-installed equipment be retrospectively applied to equipment currently operational, approved, and in service? We do have to make that assessment, whether it's worthwhile to apply the rules retrospectively, but I can't imagine that that is necessary. So very, very likely no consequences on what is approved already.
I think we will record all the questions and come back to them tomorrow in the question and answer session. Which one?
Do you have the data? No.
Michael?
Yeah. We don't have proper data on that yet, so it's a bit premature to look at that, but we will have to submit this as part of the impact assessment.